Hey everyone, Professor August here, and today I'm going to be talking about this book, Kathy Wang's Imposter Syndrome. And I was recommended this book not too long ago, maybe last year, by one of my former students, because in my courses I talk a lot about my former academic life as a historian of the Soviet Union and Russia and immigration and minorities. So one of my students recommended that I read this book, so I got a copy and just left it on my bookshelf, as a lot of us do with so many of the books that we buy. And this past week, I had the time because our semester has come to a conclusion and I have a little bit of time during this break. So I picked it up and read it and kind of loved it. It's 300 pages, published in 2021, and the story is really relatable. It's about stuff that we deal with on a day-to-day basis because it's all based in Silicon Valley and has to do with this big major company called Tangerine, which is sort of a mix of all of the companies we know of, like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and all of these companies combined into one thing, and Google as a search engine. So it's familiar to us just because of our own day-to-day lives. But the way the story unfolds is really interesting. It's a spy novel, it's an espionage tale, and it's not like one of those big TV shows where something terrible is going to happen if this weapon falls into the wrong hands, or if this flash drive goes to the wrong person, a country is going to fall, or there's going to be a massive terrorist attack or something like that. It's not one of those novels. So the stakes of it are really low, except for the characters. So if something does go wrong, the characters' lives are going to implode, and so that's what drives the narrative. What makes the story a little scarier than if it were one of these grand, epic espionage stories is that it seems plausible because the author is so familiar with Silicon Valley and the tech companies in the Bay Area. And because we, as just ordinary people living in the modern age, constantly see hacks happening and our data being leaked, and you know the government really can't or won't do major uh, like tech barriers to make it impossible for our information to be stolen or scavenged by these major companies for to sell. So like we're dealing with it on such a regular basis that's what made the story just a little scary, because it could happen. And I think I wouldn't be shocked to find out that this has actually happened or is happening currently by one of these major tech companies. So I really enjoyed it. The novel follows three major characters: Julia, Leo, and Alice. And Julia is the CEO or COO of this major tech company, Tangerine. Alice is just a middle, like, tech person, like an IT person. And Leo is Julia's handler. So as the story unfolds, it goes back and forth chapter by chapter between their different perspectives, and we get to see how they're making daily decisions, but also we get flashbacks into their past lives, their previous, their childhoods, their young adulthoods, how certain things unfolded for them. But really, it's a tale of espionage internally, meaning that Julia, as this high executive in this tech company, starts to infiltrate the company in order to pass off information to Leo, who then is passing that information up to Moscow. Alice is just a tech person, like an IT person who figures out what's happening. And as the story unfolds, they're trying to figure out how to maneuver in order to protect themselves, and also how their morality works, whether they're actually going to follow through with certain things. And we get a lot of gray area with what is right and what is wrong, and whether we would actually make the right decisions in certain situations, because sometimes our bosses tell us to do certain things. And then there's also the decision of what's right and whether we want to follow what's right, or whether we're being told to do something that, I think of like all of these historical instances of, well, I was just following orders. Okay, so this is kind of what is happening with Julia. She's being given orders and she has to make a decision as to whether or not she wants to follow through with those orders, or protect herself and the life that she's built for herself. It's really interesting because in addition to the layer of technology and Silicon Valley that we're being introduced to, we also have these characters who have distinct personalities and histories of their own. So Julia is a Russian immigrant to the United States. Alice is Asian American. She's a Chinese American whose parents have a laundry, and they're living or trying to make the American dream a reality for themselves. And so we get aspects of immigration and issues around not really racism, but sort of how race plays a factor into people's lives, especially for individuals who aren't white immigrants. So we get that dichotomy between Julia, who is an immigrant but she's white, and Alice, who is raised in the United States and goes to school in the United States and yet is still having to deal with her Asianness as she grows up. So it's a really cool way to explain race without actually it being this major, plot point. We just get instances of it through personal experience. Um, I'm not going to give away what happens at the end of the book, but towards the end of the book, things start happening and things get revealed as they always do in espionage books or in spy novels. But the way that the book ends is really clean, I think. And so uh, it's a good read just to go through and to see how these characters navigate the world and their own personal lives as things start unfolding. There are three major characters in the book: Leo, Julia, and Alice. The book starts off with Leo, and we're introduced to him as a scouter, a recruiter for the government of Russia. And he I'm kind of neutral about him as a character. We don't really learn all that much about him throughout the book. He's kind of aloof. He's standoffish, especially with Julia because he is her handler. So he doesn't really disclose that much about himself. In my mind's eye, if you've ever watched the TV show Killing Eve, the character Constantine, who is the handler of the assassin, that's kind of how I see Leo. He's just kind of like he manages the spies and he passes information along, and we don't get to know him all that well. Chapters that are about him, we get a little information about his personal life. So we know there's a spouse. We get a little bit of information about his coming up. But then towards the end of the novel is really when we start getting introduced to his mindset and the way that he thinks. He meets a new friend in the apartment complex in which he lives, and that new friend, she takes him to like a coffee shop, and they just have like little outings here and there. And so he starts to appreciate American life a little bit more, because the entire time that he goes back and forth between Russia and the United States, he's always really wary of being lured in by the way the Americans do things and sort of the laxity of our behaviors and the beliefs that we hold. And he's very stoic and rigid, and so we sort of start seeing that break down a little bit. um, but really he's there as the handler to Julia and Alice are the two major protagonists in the book, so most of the book is told from their two perspectives. Julia is a Russian who, gosh, she had a rough childhood. Her dad died when she was really young, and then her mom didn't want to take care of her anymore, so she put her into an orphanage, and she was then raised in this orphanage. While she's there, she realizes that she can pretend to be super smart, and she can pretend to um, have skills that she doesn't actually possess. And so we get aspects of what the title is, Imposter Syndrome. Like the whole book is about imposters living out their lives in the United States. Um, but so she then is cultivated or recruited by Leo and is taught to speak American the way that Americans speak English. So her American accent is almost spot on and perfect. She's able to go to the Bay Area and get a job in this major tech company. And you would kind of assume that because she's placed in this position, everything kind of happens for her. But the reality of her character and why she's so interesting is, yes, when she was a child, she was placed into an orphanage, but she figured out how to make it work. As an adult, she was placed into this organization in the Bay Area, this tech company, but she made it work for her. So she was able to rise up in the ranks and become one of the chief executives of Tangerine. When her handler tells her she has to get married, she figures it out. She finds the guy that she's going to marry. She finds the person who she thinks is suitable. So she has a lot of agency and is able to make decisions for herself, which makes her a really enticing character. In the novel, she gets pregnant with her husband, Charles, and that's when we start seeing all of the gender dynamics of what it's like to work as a woman in tech, what it's like to be an executive when you're pregnant. And there's a really interesting section where she's pregnant and she is about to give birth and decides she can't be away from her job for too long because she doesn't want other people in the company usurping her power, but also she can't be away for a very short period of time. She has to stay away for a decent amount of time because she is the marker for other women, and there are other women in tech who are paying attention to how long she's going to stay away so that they can make the case that they're going to stay away when they give birth. So there's this really interesting play here where she's a powerful woman, but she's also becoming a mother, and how that plays into this corporate dynamic. So she's made it as an American. She's an American citizen. She becomes really super wealthy and kind of famous for her position, and she doesn't want to give it up. And so that's where the conflict is for her. She's worked really, really hard to get to where she is, but she's also a spy. And so when she's given orders to do certain things and pass information on to Leo, that's where the conflict is. Is she going to do it? Is she not? How much is she going to say? How much is she going to keep for herself? And is she ultimately going to protect herself and the wealth and the family that she's created for herself in the Bay Area? The last character that is the major of the three is Alice. Alice is really interesting. So she is American, she's Asian American. She went to school here. Her mom and dad have a small business in the Bay Area. And she's kind of like me and everybody else I know. And I see people like her all the time in my classes with my students. I see it with my friends and family where she has ambition and she has dreams for herself, but she always lacks confidence. And there's always an aspect of imposter syndrome with her where she doesn't make decisions in her own best interest, but she always puts other people around her first. And so when we're first introduced to Alice, it's in the context of her boyfriend has just left her. Her boyfriend was a guy she was with for like a decade. They worked at Tangerine together, but because of some company rule, they had to stop working in the same department at the company. And so she chose to sacrifice herself and move into a lower IT job while he got to pursue his dream of becoming, this app developer or whatever. Um, and then once she does that, he decides that he's going to move to a different state and he wants to break up with her. And so ultimately, she's left in a really precarious situation because she has this really nice 2-bedroom apartment she can't pay for because her boyfriend has left, and her 2-income household has now become a 1-income household. She has debt. She doesn't come from a rich family. And she made a decision putting somebody else first. I always tell everybody this, ladies, if you are listening, if you are watching, students especially, um, don't sacrifice your own potential for somebody else's potential. Yes, they may become rich and powerful and famous, but you may also become rich, powerful, and successful and famous. And so um, protect yourself first. And then there's no reason why he can't follow you. If you're the one who's smarter and who has more potential, you be the one who gets the career and let him follow you. Doesn't have to be the other way around. And so in her case, she is the one who sacrifices herself and it doesn't work out. And so we're introduced to her as a 30 something year old who has a lot of debt, has an apartment she can't pay for, and she feels like she has let her family down because she hasn't really taken advantage of the life that America could give to an immigrant family. She's super well educated. She's really smart, but because of these poor decisions, she ends up as just a basic tech worker at Tangerine. She doesn't have respect from her colleagues. Her boss doesn't like her, and she's just in a really tough situation until she's the one who realizes or figures out that somebody higher up in the organization is stealing information. And so that's where the conflict for her starts to rise in the book, where she has to decide how to navigate the situation, who she's going to tell, who she's going to confide in, and how she's going to play it. Because ultimately, she doesn't have a lot of room to wiggle here. She's not super high up in the company, so she can easily lose her job. And she's also doing things that go against company policy. So there's a morality aspect here. Do you go up against the people who have power in your company? Do you stay silent? What decisions are you going to make? And so these are the three characters. I think they were all pretty dynamic in their own ways. Um, I was naturally drawn to Alice, anyways, because she seems so familiar to me, and her decision-making process is super familiar in my own life. Julia, interesting because of how she's able to create agency for herself and rise up in the ranks. And Leo, because he's just a handler, and he's kind of there just to give us explanations of who Julia is. Um, the last thing I'll say about these characters is the aspect of race. I think there's a section in the book where Alice is coming to the conclusion that the reason why she hasn't been able to rise up in the company, aside from the whole boyfriend issue, is because she's Asian American. And when you kind of step back and you take a look at these two characters, they're not all that dissimilar from one another. They come from like working class, poor backgrounds. They're like Alice's family is an immigrant family to the United States. Julia is an immigrant to the United States. The only difference is Julia is white and Alice is Asian American. So there's an aspect of race that kind of keeps Alice down in a way that doesn't keep Julia down. Julia never talks about race in this book. Like, it doesn't even occur to her. It's not one of the thought processes of her life. Whereas for Alice, it is something that comes up every so often in the novel. And I think that must have been a deliberate choice by the author to just drive home this fact that yeah, race is a major thing that a lot of us minorities think about on a constant basis because our decisions, the way we're treated, the way people talk to us, the way people regard us, whether they have respect for us or not, a lot of this is tinged with race. Whereas for somebody like Julia, because she is white and she passes as an American, there isn't a whole lot of racial anxiety in her life. There's a whole lot of gender anxiety, so she has to navigate the world as a woman. So we get a lot of that from her perspective. So I thought it was an interesting way that the author did this, and I think it was kind of um, driving home this true fact about living in the United States without being super didactic about it. The book is actually really easy to read because there isn't any jargon in there. It's easy to follow. Each chapter is really clearly delineated between the characters, so you know when you're in Leo's perspective or Alice's perspective or Julia's perspective. There's no confusion about what's going on. The writing is super clear. This is a story about like espionage, spycraft, and just daily living. So there's not a whole lot in there that is convoluted. The writing isn't like super poetic or anything like that. It's just straightforward. This is what's happening. These are the decisions being made. There are two small sections in the book that were like I kind of chalk them up to the same feeling I have when I'm watching a spy TV show where or like a criminal TV show where like the police are saying something that I don't understand, or like the hacker dude is saying something I don't understand. There's one section where I think it's Julia's character is saying something about technology, and I'm like, I don't know what that means, and you just keep going because it has nothing to do with the plot. Um, and then there's another section. I think it's from Leo's perspective where we're learning about like the hierarchy of Leo's job and him passing information on to this person and that person, and it really isn't important to the story. It's just some background information about Leo. And I'm reading it going, okay, next bit of information, because it's just kind of like, again, it's like noise, filler noise in that sense. But aside from those two small sections, like the book is fine. It's super cohesive. It's easy to get through. And it's just a fun read because it's about technology and the stuff that we live with on a day-to-day basis. And again, it's kind of scary in the sense that it's probably happening with these tech companies and we just don't know about it because this information isn't being disclosed to us as users. But we all kind of assume, or at least I do, that whatever I post on social media is being grabbed by the company, and it's not just my friends who are seeing it, but it's everybody who's seeing it. So I kind of go into social media knowing that, or just assuming that that's the case, even with whatever privacy clauses and the statements that the tech guys put out and say, your information is safe and yada. Well, I don't know that it is. I just assume that it's not. And the scary part isn't that the information is being taken, it's what happens when the companies and the people who are working within the company are the ones who are deliberately taking that information to pass along to a third party. So that's kind of the scary bit of it. But it's what also makes the book super intriguing because, yeah, we have a lot of tech companies and we have a lot of really famous companies here on the West Coast and especially in the Bay Area. And some of them are super famous, these individuals, and we see them on the news all of the time. And they're making decisions that really do impact the rest of us because they're so intertwined with our government at this point. Um, so that's kind of the part that makes the book interesting and drives it along. I really enjoyed it. I think if you're looking for a novel that just is a fun read, this is the one for you. If you're interested in purchasing a copy, I'm going to put the publisher's link in the description box below. All right, bye. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe below. Catch you in the next video.